Hey everybody, welcome to The Thoughtful Bro, live streaming to you on a mighty blaze. I'm so happy for today's interview. Frankly, one of the best books I've read in a while, and certainly some of the best nonfiction I've read in a while. This book, written by Harley Rustad, my guest today, it's a universal book. It's got great themes for kind of searching, questing people of any gender, but specifically men who are kind of looking for meaning in their life and looking for an adventurous life. There's just so much about this story to praise, and I cannot wait to get into it in a moment. But first, just a few words from me as usual. Thoughtful Bros here every Tuesday at 2 to talk about what makes great books tick, what makes great authors tick. We're part of a Mighty Blaze. There's lots of other shows on a Mighty Blaze too. We are an all-volunteer initiative that was founded at the beginning of COVID to help writers reach readers when book tours were getting canceled, and we have had tremendous success thanks to all of you guys who watch, so we appreciate that. If you want to show us a little love, or if you're new to a Mighty Blaze, please just give us a like or a follow. That's it. We don't need your money. We just need you to leave a comment on the video or like us on social media like YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. There's a lot of other ways to interact with the Mighty Blaze as well. You can go to amightyblaze.com and sign up for our weekly newsletter, where on Sunday you'll get a list of all the interviews coming up that week. All of them are with the freshest of authors, people who have books that have just come out or are about to come out. We also have the Mighty Blaze podcast, which is now in its third season. So check that out wherever you find your podcasts. A few other quick housekeeping things. One is that we have our first ever annual Mighty Blaze survey that we're going to pop into the chat. So please just take a minute, click on that. It takes 5 minutes. Tell us what we're doing well or where we could improve, the kinds of authors you'd like to see, maybe that aren't represented on the shows yet. There's a lot of ways to just give us feedback so we can improve. We also are looking for interns at A Mighty Blaze. So if you're interested, just send us an email to amightyblaze@gmail.com, and we will talk to you about maybe becoming an intern at A Mighty Blaze. Again, we're not asking for any money. If you are, in fact, in the mood to spend money, this is what I would encourage you to do. Go on HarperCollins or Amazon or Barnes & Noble or bookshop.org and buy Lost in the Valley of Death. This is like, not only is it gripping kind of true crimey mystery nonfiction, but again, digs into a lot of ideas about what it means to lead an authentic life. And it's written, frankly, by a hot, new, up-and-coming author. And you want to get on the Harley train early, folks. One last thing, a tease for next week. I'm going to be interviewing, 2 weeks from now, I'm going to be interviewing Kimberly Jones, who wrote a book, also nonfiction, called How We Can Win: Race, History, and the Changing of the Money Game. Kimberly Jones rose to fame after a super viral speech she made in the wake of the George Floyd murder and the protests in Atlanta that followed that. And she gave this speech that has been viewed millions of times about the kind of economic situation of African Americans. So that's going to be a great interview on what's going on in race right now. That's in 2 weeks. But now, with no further ado, Harley Rustad's writing has appeared in Outside Magazine, The Walrus, The Globe and Mail, Geographical, The Guardian, and CNN. He is the features editor at The Walrus. He's a faculty editor at the Banff Center's Mountain and Wilderness Writing Residency. He's also the founder of the Port Renfrew Writers Retreat. His first book was called Big Lonely Doug, the story of one of Canada's last great trees. Book was named one of the best books of 2018 by the Globe and Mail. His next book, his second book, is called Lost in the Valley of Death, a story of obsession and danger in the Himalayas. It's about the mysterious disappearance of Justin Alexander Shetler in a remote mountain valley in India. Justin was a social media celebrity who was once called the most interesting person on Instagram. It's been drawing great and favorable comps to John Krakauer's Into the Wild for obvious reasons. And Pico Iyer, who is a legendary travel writer, called it one of the most haunting books of recent times. Somerset Maugham's classic Razor's Edge, updated to the age of Instagram. Harley, welcome to The Thoughtful Bro.
Thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure.
Awesome. It's so great to have you here. This was really a white knuckle read. I'm not kidding when I say that. I read it in 2 sittings in the course of one day. Child raising be damned. I had to finish this book. This is just a fascinating story on so many levels. I legitimately don't even know where to begin, but I guess the best place to begin is just to talk about Justin, the guy at the center of this story. I mean, just to give a little bit of kind of who this guy was, it's fascinating. He is originally from Florida. He was 35 at the time of his disappearance. I'm going to give you a little resume here. He's an elite wilderness survivalist. He's a motorcycle rider. He trains Navy SEALs. He climbs bridges illegally at night. He has movie star good looks. He takes care of lost pets. He became a Buddhist monk in Thailand. He toured Japan as the front man of an indie rock band. He got rich as an entrepreneur. And then at 32, he retired to travel the world. And at 35, he went lost in India. I mean, tell us about how you knew this was the book for you to write.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great summary. And it really kind of highlights the fact that he was, despite being 35, despite being fairly young, was somebody who kind of lived many lives. Like, he had these iterations to himself, and these big transformations in his life through his 20s and his early 30s that, some of the things you mentioned, he threw himself as a teenager into these elite wilderness schools in Washington State and in New Jersey, the Tracker School, the most famous one in New Jersey, under this guy named Tom Brown Jr. And then he worked as a mentor for youth kids in San Francisco and played in this punk rock band that was quite successful. And he was the kind of person that seemed like was never totally satisfied with who he was, but also what he was doing, and therefore had no hesitation with transforming himself and reinventing himself and trying something new. And also the kind of person that did it to the absolute fullest. He was not shy of the extreme and was not shy of pushing himself. And yeah, you're right. In the end, he was somebody who had this kind of big break, had met success along the way, and then had this big moment of realization that the path that he was on was not one that was ultimately fulfilling him. Quit his job, hit the road across the US on this Royal Enfield motorcycle, this, romantic machine, which was so kind of classic Justin. And that began this long 3-year journey that ultimately led him on this international trip and finally to India, where he ultimately tragically disappeared. And so for all those reasons, I was just kind of enthralled by this person, this life, this journey, and some of the big questions that I think his life represented and spoke to.
It is just so fascinating, as I said, on so many levels. And, I want to talk first about, let's just jump right into comparing him to Chris McCandless of Into the Wild. And I think for me, there's just some differences right off the top. I mean, I think there is a kind of spiritual questing which is present in Justin's story, which isn't in Chris's story so much. But the comparisons are sort of obvious, but they also diverge pretty quickly as well. Mm-hmm. Tell me how you see that. What are the differences between these two characters? I
think you're right. I think there's some obvious similarities in that they were two, young men who disappeared, under very mysterious circumstances initially, doing something fairly extreme. In McCandless's case, that was isolating himself, testing himself physically in the wilds of Alaska, and trying to kind of seek a greater connection with nature. In Justin's case, it was something that was in some ways kind of more metaphysical, something a little bit more intangible. Obviously, because of his survivalist and kind of nature background, he definitely sought that kind of connection with the environment and with nature. But I think the big divergence is obviously the time in which they lived. And McCandless was the early 90s. The legacy that he left, the people he touched, was a very kind of intimate, personal one. And the materials that John Krakauer kind of used to recreate that story were personal letters and journals and things that were never really meant to be read by anyone other than the recipient. And Justin lived, in the modern age and grew up as kind of a child of Instagram and found a lot of success on social media and this very kind of large, sizable following. And I think that influenced his actions to a degree that McCandless was very kind of brooding and internal. And I think while Justin had that, he was also motivated by very external forces, the pressure that social media may have on you as an adventurer, or you as a traveler, or you as a survivalist, or you as, kind of the broad definition of a seeker, somebody who, deeply questions their place in the universe and their connection to something bigger. And I think that was a big difference that I always saw between the two of them and it became a very, very fascinating question for me to explore in the book, was how much of who Justin was, how much of what happened to him in the end was motivated by, was influenced by, was pressured by the fact that he had tens of thousands of people behind him on their screens, not only living vicariously through him, but wanting him to share incredible pictures, find the next big story, and to bring them along for the ride. And I think that was a big, big difference and a really kind of fascinating aspect to Justin's story and Justin's life.
It is a fascinating aspect. I mean, it made me think of so much, just everything you just said. I mean, I heard another person who interviewed you just say that Justin was the star of the movie about Justin. So there is this pressure, as you use that word, pressure to kind of create more product, create another chapter in the narrative, and bring other people along. It also raises the question to me of, Chris McCandless, had he lived 20 years later, would he have been on social media as well? I mean, there's this saying that you hear all the time, pics or it didn't happen, right? I mean, how can you say you're a survivalist and you went out in the wilderness and you had this great adventure and you don't even have any pictures of it and you didn't put it on Instagram? I mean, it's almost inevitable in a way.
No, it absolutely is inevitable. And I think it's impossible for Justin's life and for some of the actions that he took, because they were so extreme. And he definitely had this extreme bone in his body that I think a lot of people don't necessarily have. They may want to travel the world. They may want to go to a place like India. They may want to, go hiking for 2 weeks on their own. But Justin was the kind of guy that took that to a different level, because he saw, and he really believed that there was something beautiful to be found in those extremes, at the ends of those paths, at the end of that kind of long, hard road, that there was going to be something big for him. But it was hard for me not to ignore the fact that without this kind of pressure, it was hard for me not to kind of question some of the decisions he made. Did he ultimately, and this was a big question that he grappled with up until the very end, did he ultimately do these things? Did he push himself to such extremes? Did he, in the end, hike to this holy lake to spend weeks in isolation up there because he truly believed that at the end of that road, he was going to get something out of it because it was something deeply personal to him? Or was this motivated because he knew at the end of that road, when he came back down, reconnected to Wi-Fi, he was going to have the most incredible story of, a Hindu holy man who guided him to the source of this holy river, meditating under the stars and living in a cave. It's hard not, and I empathize with that, because it's hard not to be seduced by those types of, that type of validation. And we all have that. We all have our social media accounts, whichever one we use. We all obviously curate our lives. We post what we want to post. We want to be seen as smarter or more adventurous or what have you online. But what really fascinated me with Justin was that question of was he doing that for himself or was he doing that for his audience? And I think you can make the argument in different cases for both.
Right. So I want to get into that in a minute, this kind of question of authenticity and what is an authentic life. But before we get into that, I just one comment to the audience. I'm seeing a lot of great comments, guys. If you want to ask a question, just pop the question in the chat and I'll ask it. But keep the comments coming. So Harley, I was thinking to myself this morning as I was getting ready for this interview, I'm like, who is he like? If it's because it's not McCandless, right? It's like sort of similar, but I'm like, is there another kind of figure out there, a trope, if you will, a figure from history, whatever, that he is more like? And so I started thinking, like, because it's not inherently bad to want an audience for something that you do. And let me just give you two great examples of that. One is Anthony Bourdain. Certainly a guy who has his own demons. That's a separate subject. But like, he was like, I love food and I want to show the world the cuisine of the world. So I'm going to go to all these far-flung places and try the cuisine and tell people about it. And that's a great show, and that brings a lot of good things to people. Another one is this guy Jeremy Wade of a show that I love called River Monsters. So for those who don't know River Monsters, I am not a fisherman, but like for some reason I'm like captivated by this show. He just goes to all these random rivers and lakes and oceans in the world and tries to catch these extremely rare fish, which he then throws back. But like, so River Monsters, it's a similar kind of thing. Now, I think the issue here with Justin is that it's a kind of spiritual adventure tourism. But the problem with him, and I think like what maybe rubbed people a little bit the wrong way, is like, he never quite gave over to that idea of like, I am a tour guide of the world's spiritual quests. He always tried to make it seem like I actually am looking for this thing, which I think was difficult. But like the one figure that I came across that I thought maybe is the right one is Sir Richard Burton, the famous British explorer. Now Sir Richard Burton, maybe more of an intellectual than Justin was. He translated the Kama Sutra, but he also was the first white man, the first Westerner to ever go to the holy city of Mecca. And he risked, if he was found out, he would have been killed. But maybe Richard Burton is sort of this guy who is this kind of like spiritual adventurist. Do you see that?
In some ways, for sure. I mean, I think, and there are, now that you mention it, kind of similarities to their two stories, even kind of Burton was trying to find the source of this kind of magical legendary river.
Right.
But I think the thing with Justin is that, he kind of loved these stories. I think he would love this discussion because he from a very young age was so fascinated with these types of figures in history and mythology, and grew up as kind of a child of Joseph Campbell and idolized his writings, and in some ways, I guess in a lot of ways, tried to kind of fit his life into a very kind of classic hero's journey, Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, which is this very kind of classic paradigm of a narrative arc for all these different stories that influenced pop culture, Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, you name it, and I think at times he became, in some ways, too devoted to trying to cram his life into this rubric. And I think that ultimately presented him with a number of challenges, is because he was so steeped in this kind of classic mythological arc of, beginning of a quest, meeting a guide or mentor who leads you off on this journey. This is all going to sound very familiar to people, but like,
I'm a big Campbell fan myself. So
exactly. Yeah. But then, grappling with your father and, being tempted by all these other different forces that are trying to lead you astray. And then ultimately having this series of trials that leads you through the gates of, grand awakening and realization. And then, the kind of interesting twist on it is some people come back as, in like Frodo Baggins did, comes back with this knowledge, comes back with this experience. And some people don't. Some people stay and remain in that state, in that final moment.
Right.
And so I think, to try to compare him with a lot of historical figures or figures in literature, I think is actually fairly appropriate, because Justin wanted that. He wanted to have those types of experiences. He wanted to set, and his quitting his job in the end and hitting the road was a very intentional, devoted, specific thing that he had thought about for many, many years and had aligned his life to that moment. And I think the challenge for him was, trying to align himself so perfectly into this moment into this path is a near impossible feat. Yeah. Because of course you're going to be steered astray, and of course you're going to push yourself to either find the temptation or find the trial. And I think that ultimately became a really interesting kind of twist on Justin's story as it fit into the hero's journey, as it fit into Campbell's framework, was, how much of this was sort of a natural, as you said, kind of authentic experience, and how much of this was him trying to place those trials in front of him, trying to push himself so that he had, at the end, at that moment, like all of the heroes that had come before him, the realization that he desperately wanted in his life. And that becomes a very tricky thing when you are not only walking the path, but laying the bricks yourself.
Yeah. My goodness. It's so fascinating. And just in that moment, there's so many, you bring it up a lot in the book about the way he's trying to kind of map his life on. In fact, one of the characters in the book says he always felt with Justin that it was sort of like a life in search of a narrative, or like just kind of trying to impose his just constant kind of striving to impose this kind of structure or meaning onto the events of his life. But one famous example from mythology that I just thought of is when he leaves this entrepreneurial job where he got kind of modestly wealthy. It's sort of like the Buddha's great renunciation, right? You walk away from wealth and into enlightenment. I mean, it's just one of many examples.
I read Siddhartha when I was a kid in high school, like a lot of people did, and reread it again when I first went to India in 2008. Of course, was in Bodh Gaya, so I had to read Siddhartha, and then reread it again when I was working on this book, and had these moments of, oh my gosh, there were so many parallels to this story. Even meeting kind of the ferryman and the person who's going to guide you across this river. There were so many moments in that story where it got kind of spooky. And at the end, in my book, hopefully I'm not giving anything away, but there was this kind of moment of realization that I had about how much time Justin had spent in the Parvati Valley, how many days he had spent, and paralleled that with how many days the Buddha sat under the tree to achieve enlightenment. And it was just this kind of, it was a moment for me too. Anyway. So.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up Siddhartha. It's also a book that I love. And, like the way that Hermann Hesse book goes is that at first he is a devout religious student in the same way that Justin became this monk in Thailand. And then he sort of becomes disillusioned and realizes I need to go on my own quest. So in Siddhartha, the main character becomes very rich as a businessman. And that's what Justin did. And then there's like the third act is when he then renounces the wealth he's created to go again. And boy, that does really map pretty well.
Well, and even before Justin had that experience in Thailand, he went to Thailand for the first time and met this young Thai man who took him to his home village, and Justin inquired about how he could possibly become a monk, and kind of blew off the tourist thing where you do it for a couple of days and that's it. And Justin spent a month and memorized all these things and actually passed this initiation ceremony, which is no small thing to do. But even before that, he was brought up into this really interesting spiritual conglomerate of his father, who traveled to India in the 70s and became really fascinated with Hinduism and aspects of Buddhism and incorporated that into his life very dramatically. And so Justin was kind of brought up under that. And then under his mom, she was a believer of Ekankar, which is this really small, interesting, fascinating faith that kind of brings in all of these different Eastern teachings and is really kind of focused on dreams and journaling. And so he was brought up under this really different and kind of fascinating spiritual upbringing, a spiritual kind of set of spiritual teachings. And then he had this moment when he was kind of in his later teenage years, when he had a very serious car accident where, and he should have died, he should have, and he was very, very close to it, and had this moment of realization or of questioning that, if whatever it is out there, if it's God or Shiva or whoever you want to call it, if they are truly looking out for me, why would they bring me this close to death? And why would they put me through this? And he had this huge moment that I think in some ways would push people closer into religion and give them kind of a reason for why they survived. For him at that moment, it really pushed him away from it. And it began this long journey. One of the big things that he grappled with and was searching for was, where does he fit into the greater cosmos? Where does he fit into all of these different traditions that exist in the world and around him? And so he had these other parallels of this huge moment of devastation, physical and emotional and spiritual. And then that ultimately did set him onto a new path, one that was kind of deeply questioning and deeply curious, but also fairly skeptical as well.
Right. Before we move on to another topic, I just want to ask one more question about authenticity, because I feel like, this is just one of the most fascinating kind of character studies about the topic of what it means to live an authentic life that you could find. I mean, it comes at this topic of authenticity from so many angles. And the reason why I'm bringing it up and we're sort of harping on it on this interview is because it's such an important question in today's culture. There's this big emphasis on authenticity and about that is how you kind of thrive. It's a big idea in business. That's how businesses thrive. It's a big idea on social media. That's how you become a social media star, or how to behave as a celebrity, or just how you be happy is being authentic. Authenticity is central in our culture right now. And this man is a paradox of like all the different strange kind of like sides of authenticity. And I think, like, just to bring up a few more things, one is that not everything that he put on Instagram was real. I mean, he sort of obfuscated and changed the facts of kind of the exact experience that he had. He fiddled with his photos a little bit. He maybe disguised kind of who was helping him, or if people were really his friends, or if he was paying them or whatever. And I think like that sort of rubs people the wrong way. Obviously, the performative aspect of authenticity is a question. And then frankly, I'm thinking about it in the moment in this interview with you talking about how he's trying to map his life onto these external myths. That is just kind of the definition of inauthenticity. It's just you are trying to impose a narrative where something might not organically exist. And so I guess just to put this all into a question, I mean, like, was he an authentic person?
Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting question. It's such an interesting issue that I became kind of one of the central arcs in his story and in the book. That I think, talk about kind of McCandless and Justin differences. I think this was one that really kind of stood out as different in Justin's story. I don't think anyone was necessarily questioning McCandless's authenticity. I think
Right.
he absolutely wanted to live the life he wanted to live and hit that first domino and away he went. But when you add on all these other layers to it, it becomes a much more complicated question in Justin's case. And it's something, you're right, it's something that we all struggle with. It's something that we all deeply want to be. We all want to be authentic. We all want to be, but ultimately, I guess for me, the way that I've always seen that word is kind of a different look on it. To me, we've all just wanted to be honest. We want to see honesty and we want to be honest. We want to see truth in something and we want to be truthful with ourselves. And I think that's where people get uncomfortable with what they see or what they experience, and then also how they themselves act, is that they don't feel that what their experience is truthful, is being honest with them. And I think that appears in travel a ton. There's been this huge push in the past couple of decades for authentic travel. And I have always kind of questioned what that actually means, because to me, it often is presented as a way that essentially is kind of traditional, and it's looking at a place or a people, a village, and kind of having this expectation that it's going to be what you've heard it to be. And that just is never really the case. Places change, places develop, people move, things grow up. And that expectation, I think, can be harmful sometimes, is to expect that, and I wrote this kind of op-ed last week for the Globe and Mail about this, that, we expect the Himalayan village to remain exactly as it has been for decades. And that's not great. That is like quite deeply problematic, to go to a place and have these expectations that it is going to have the same thatched roof and the same the same kind of traditions that have been practiced for centuries.
Right.
And But it's funny because we want that. We want that experience because we think it's going to be more authentic. And yet we definitely want Wi-Fi because then we need to share that experience. So it's got these all, and I don't mean to come across as being too critical, but I'm fascinated by these types of issues and where these things kind of rub and start to have friction and tension. But ultimately, I think to your question, the what we want internally is we want the experience to be honest with us. We want our experience with the place to be truthful, and we want how we are presenting ourselves to the world in person and online to be ultimately rooted in accuracy and truth.
Yeah.
And the problem is that it never really is. We always crop our photos. We always there's photo editing software to erase everybody out of a picture so it looks perfectly isolated and pristine and untouched. And that is just never the case. And we create these stories to present something that is never really fully accurate. I think the quicker that we can all realize that our profound impact on a place, and that we do carry these things with us when we travel or when we post something online, the better off I think we're all going to be. But I think with Justin is that he was very, very uncomfortable with all of these things. He definitely played into it. He knew that a story of him, hiking to this remote valley on his own, which he did in Nepal in 2014, was going to be this incredible story, sleeping in a cave. This was, a couple years before India, was going to be this incredible story. And when I was, bowled over by it until I started digging into the story and found that what he had presented online was not accurate. He had got permits. He had went with a guide. He had went with a fellow traveler. All of these things, the veil of that story, the authenticity of what was presented starts to come down.
But I mean, we don't have to belabor this much longer, but I mean, this is not a new problem. It takes a new form with social media, but this is a problem at least as old as Henry David Thoreau. I mean, he was doing a performance of Hermeticism out by Walden Pond, and he wasn't really, his mom was doing his laundry, and he was doing it with the intention of writing about doing it and observing nature. And hey, he wrote some great books out there and some great letters to his friends, but he knew that he was doing it to create that work of literature. And it's so the performance of authenticity and, what are your motives? I mean, at some point you just have to take a step back and be like, you know what, this is just a really cool picture. And I'm so glad this guy went there. And I'm glad I'm thinking about these kinds of things. And to pick that apart is maybe just a futile exercise, and it's inescapable even without Instagram.
I think partly, but I think that's what fascinated me so much about Justin's story. And I don't, and I really tried to kind of refrain from too much criticism or too much kind of making a big kind of ideological point in the book, because I do give Justin a ton of credit for the things that he did. And I do think he was very aware. I think he was incredibly aware. I think there's some people that would say, I don't do that. I post my authentic life. I'm fully truthful online. This is who I am. And I don't really believe that, but they will say that. And Justin, there was almost always kind of a nod to the camera. There was always kind of, I know that there is a lens there. I know that there is a viewer there. How can I inspire you? I know you're there. I'm not discounting that fact. And how can I inspire you? How can I use my life to have some kind of profound impact on this world, which ultimately is something that we would all love. We'd all love to, leave our fingerprint on history or whatever. And I have zero criticism of Justin and what he tried to achieve in that, because I think that is something that is deeply universal, that we all really want to have an impact, whether that's on, the 50 people around us or, the 5 million that you could potentially touch by being a social media influencer. And I think the awareness, I give him a ton of credit for that awareness. He knew it. And to me, as someone who was grappling with this story, and it became this really, really interesting aspect that made this story, I think, a very kind of 21st century update to a lot of these types of adventure stories.
Yeah. All right. Well, we have to move on to a different topic, but I think one of the reasons why we spent so long on that is because this is just a new kind of story, and it's, what is reality and what is a performance on social media is something that, frankly, every human being with a phone grapples with right now. And so it's just a great aspect of this story. But so I want to move on to a few other things, just sort of about like what he was looking for in India in particular. There's this great term in the book that I'd never heard before called India syndrome. Right, which is, so you describe it in the book. There's like two things. So basically, India syndrome describes, what happens to people when they show up in India and how they sort of go crazy in this certain way, in this certain kind of spiritual way. And there's somebody in the book describes there's kind of two types of people. One is a person who has a certain idea of India and kind of goes there to fulfill, like you were describing earlier, like that particular thatched hut, like I'm going to go there and be taught by this particular guru and have a particular kind of enlightenment, and I'm going to fulfill this spiritual fantasy. And then the other person is maybe somebody who is a little bit broken inside, and being exposed to the great and deep spiritual traditions of India sort of brings this brokenness to the surface. And I think in the case of Justin, it was a little bit of both. But I guess I'm happy to hear you comment on that. But I mean, the real question I wanted to ask you is, you went to India, you've been to India several times, and it exerted a pull on you, and it captured your imagination. And I guess part of my question is just around this India syndrome thing and the effect that India has on people. Why does India exert this pull on people, and or is it more about a kind of certain deficiency within the culture of the West that creates that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting, totally fascinating concept that I came across many years ago, and I kind of saw expressions of it when I first went to India in 2008, 2009. I was kind of a classic post-college graduate, had no idea what I wanted to do with my life, so I went to India for a year to try to find some kind of answers and what I wanted to do. And I saw these people there that had, I in some ways kind of were surprised by. These are kind of travelers, but was also kind of deeply admired that they had found this path, found this conviction, this dedication in a place like India, and had, in some cases, in kind of the more extreme cases, had completely given up their previous lives. Right. And I mentioned this one example in the book, and this was I encountered this man at the end of this year, that first year in India, who was from Sweden, was living in a cave on the banks of the Ganges River in Rishikesh, where the Beatles, did their pilgrimage and wrote the White Album in that ashram, and had burnt his passport and had no intention of ever going home, and had been there for 7 years. And me sitting there as, a 23-year-old was just fascinated by what brought somebody to that point in that country of all countries. And so it opened up all these questions for me about, what is it about that place specifically, but also what is it about, people in North America and people in Europe and essentially people outside of the country. What is it in our minds? What kind of stories have we built up about that place, whether they're accurate or not accurate, that has fed this kind of highway of people going there to find themselves, to find enlightenment. And I think, in part, it is something that is very kind of special about that corner of the world. It is a place where so many people have gone to with questions and have found what they were looking for. It is a place where not only the Buddha and Mahavira and figures like that have had their great awakening, but so many people who followed in their footsteps to try to find some tiny fraction of what they achieved there.
Right.
And so it is a place that, for a lot of people, and maybe I'll just speak from my personal experiences, but I was born on the west coast of Canada in a small town on a small island, and I land in India and every single thing is different. And it wasn't just culture shock. It were these deep, big questions that I was being asked on my walk to just get breakfast in the morning. And questions I had never been asked about my place in the world, about my privilege, about class and disability and all sorts of things that you can be asked those questions in other countries as a traveler, but India can be relentless with its questioning. And so I think there are some things that are, and because it is kind of the birthplace of some big religions, it is the place that just kind of, bleeds this force that you feel like you can tap into. And I think that's partly created across oceans and across borders back home for us. And,
Right.
I grew up with stories of India from my dad, who traveled there in 66 and 67 and 67, 68. And all of these books that I had read as India is this kind of magical place, which is absolutely, I'm not going to deny the fact that is rooted in Orientalist stereotypes, which is problematic. There are a lot of issues there. But the product, those people that arrive there, whether they're coming from one of those two streams, whether it's they land there with all of these built up notions of what they hope to achieve in that country and throw themselves into it to try to find them. And along that path become kind of lost along the way.
Right.
Or if there's somebody who comes with some kind of deep rooted issue that they hope to resolve there. Both of those in the end ended up with these absolutely fascinating cases of people who would renounce their lives and go and find a little hut in the mountains and live out their days there. And to me, that one was this kind of fascinating issue to include in the book, but also a question ultimately hanging over Justin's story is, what did he bring to India with? What questions did he come with? What trauma or personal issues did he bring to India with? And what also notions about India, what he hoped to achieve there, did he bring? And then what happened in those months when he arrived that exaggerated his experience or dangled that carrot in front of him and led him to the mountains, led him to that valley, and led him to that holy lake, that fateful final journey to the holy lake. It became this really kind of fascinating layer to this story about what draws people there specifically and what happens to people on the ground there.
And I will say, I don't want to get into it now, because one of the reasons I don't want to get into it is because I don't want to give anything away. But the book contains this tremendous twist, which is about some of what he brought himself to India and something that he might have been on the run from within himself. And it's dropped late into the book, and it was totally recasts what I had read before. It added this deep, deep emotion to the book, and frankly made him an extraordinarily sympathetic character. And so I don't want to say too much more, but just what a great moment in the book. And I thought you masterfully revealed that other layer of his character.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad that you felt that way, because it was, as kind of a journalist or an author of nonfiction, you get presented with a lot of information. And particularly when you're writing about somebody's life and their history, and your decision is what to include and what not to include, and then when to include it.
Right.
And this was something that I made a very, very strong effort to treat as sensitively as I possibly could, and thought a lot about when to include it in the book. And that was, was quite intentional to do that, and for a lot of reasons. And I hope that when readers come across it, that they will have a similar experience that you had. Is this kind of slightly reframing of who he was, and hopefully we'll kind of understand why I did that.
Great. All right. So we're almost out of time, but I actually want to go a few minutes over if we could. And I just, to the folks who are listening, there's a tremendous passage in this book. And as somebody who has kind of read a lot about spirituality, but I'm not an outdoorsman myself, I have often just wondered, in somebody who's like Justin, who is somebody who's kind of mixing kind of nature loving with spiritual kind of questing and spiritual enlightenment. It was fascinating to me to read this one passage, which was kind of about what people who go into nature for this kind of oneness with nature and a spiritual odyssey that has a natural aspect to it, what are they really looking for, and how does that manifest? And folks, if you just give us a minute here, I want to have Harley read this passage.
Yeah.
I think it's just an incredible passage. It's another character in the book kind of describing what Justin might find if he goes and meditates for several months and is alone in nature. What will that spiritual transformation feel like? Harley, why don't you read that?
Yeah, so this is a section in the book where the character that Mark's talking about is this author and very, very well-traveled. He wrote a book called The Most Traveled Man, I think it's called. Mike Spencer Bound. He traveled to every single country in the world. And Justin became interested with him and reached out to him. And they started this kind of friendship. And Bound also has a lot of experience isolating himself in the wild, largely in Canada. And has this really interesting kind of take about what happens to people who isolate themselves for very long periods of time, completely on their own in nature. It's an entirely different way to be human, Bound explains. He told Justin about a pattern he had noticed among people who had done multi-month stints in complete isolation in nature. After 10 days, time starts to distort. You begin to lose the awareness of what day it is, or exactly how many days have passed since you began. Around 25 days in, you begin to lose the habit of compressing thoughts into words, and your internal monologue evaporates. You run on intuition. At 40 days, you enter into a kind of dream state in which days and nights blend together. You dream when you are awake, and you're aware of reality when you sleep. At 65 days, Bound told Justin, you begin to become more aware of the natural processes around you. You start to notice the life cycles of birds and animals, and even subtle changes in plants fluctuating by day or night, in cool weather or hot. But the biggest change after 2 months is that you lose yourself. Your sense of being an individual relating to a community or society fades, and you become just another aspect of the nature that surrounds you. He wanted to go all the way to the dissolving of self after 65 days, Bound recalls. He wanted to experience the whole thing.
Just incredible. Just a great piece of writing. And then I guess do you feel like does that make sense to you, that that's what Justin was after up at that lake?
I think so. I mean, in a way, when Justin disappeared, there were all these different theories about what might have happened to him. And partly based on what he told people, partly based on what he posted online, there's this kind of infamous last line that he posted to his blog post, which is, I'm about to go on this pilgrimage, this holy lake. If I don't come back, don't look for me. And people picked that apart and analyzed it. Was he joking? Was he serious? But when I started talking with Bound and Bound kind of shared the messages that he and Justin had shared, it added this big question to what might have happened up there in this final point. Because India has this long history of people who've gone there and given up their lives and found a new path and began walking. The question for me going into this project and going into all of this reporting, and that still is this kind of lingering, hopeful moment in this book, is Justin still alive? Did he go to this holy lake to find this moment where he lost the sense of self, where that individuality started to fade, him as a persona on social media and him as a traveler and a son and a best friend and a partner? Did he go searching for that moment where the self started to dissipate and he became part of something bigger, part of some bigger cosmos, part of some bigger Mother Nature, however you want to call it? And I think looking at Justin's life, the entirety of his life, from him being this survivalist kid trying to connect with nature so deeply, to what he was thinking about in his final moments before he disappeared. Ultimately, when you look at this quote and you look at what he was thinking about before he embarked on this trek, it's impossible to not wonder that. And I think for me, it's impossible to not lose sight of that little kind of glimmer of hope that maybe he found what he was looking for.
Oof. Beautifully said. Beautifully said. And another great irony of all of this is that not only might he have found that spiritually, but in some way he wanted to be a hero who embodied, I mean, what do heroes do? They embody people's dreams. They achieve things that other people feel like they themselves cannot achieve. They have this kind of super strength that some of us lack, or super willpower. And like you, the fact of you writing this book is in many ways a fulfillment of those heroic dreams of his. That's kind of another irony of the story.
Yeah, and I remember talking with a few of his close friends, and when I first started talking to them, and they were saying, "Oh, this is so great that a book is coming out about him," because he always wanted to write his story. And I think that is fascinating in all the things that we've talked about fabricating a narrative and seeing your life as a book, seeing your life as a story rather than just living your life. It touches on a lot of things we've talked about today. But I think in the end, somebody said to me, wouldn't it be crazy if he kind of stepped out of the mountains and, called you up and said that he found your book. And I don't know, I've thought a ton about what I know, that the likelihood of that is small, but I've thought a ton about what that would actually mean for me as a writer and as somebody who has taken on this incredible privilege of telling somebody's story and trying to tell it accurately and fully. I hope if that does happen, that he likes it in the end. But yeah.
Yeah, I think he would. I mean, it's just a really well done piece. So look, there's one more question for me, and then there's one question from Mary O'Malley in the audience, which was actually going to be my final question, but we're going to give it to Mary. But so folks, we have not even scratched the surface of like what an interesting kind of like compelling like true crime book this is. I mean, really, I am, because I've kind of have a philosophical bent, I'm sort of interested in the spiritual aspects of this and the character aspects of it. But really the book reads like a kind of true crime podcast where it's like, what happened to this guy? Where is he? And where was he seen last? And there's all this fascinating stuff about the last people who saw him, and then they changed their story, and then somebody who's a witness ends up dead in a prison. And like, oh my goodness, there's a whole different kind of thriller aspect to the book, which we're not even touching on. But I guess just to ask you one question about that, I would just say, and this, we're almost running out of time, so you probably won't be able to do this quite justice without laying a lot of groundwork, but to the best of your ability, given that we haven't really talked a lot about the details of his disappearance, what is the most confounding aspect of his story to you in terms of the disappearance? Like, what is, if you could sort of like as a detective come across the killer piece of evidence or what have you, like what would that be? What beguiles you the most?
It's a hard question to answer without giving away too much.
Right.
So let me see if I can do this. Let's just say that at a certain point, Justin's disappearance obviously sparked a lot of concern and this search for him. So, family members and friends went to India and had this enormous effort back in the US and internationally to try to piece together what might have happened, following threads on social media, talking to people, getting people involved, getting boots on the ground. And the other thing sorry, just a little tangent. The other thing we haven't mentioned is that Justin disappeared in a part of India where there's been dozens of other disappearances dating back to the early 90s. So he was somebody who was kind of the latest person to disappear in this long history, very tragic and mysterious history of people who disappeared in the Parvati Valley, this one tiny corner of India. And so he was kind of the latest example of this. And this great search effort started to try to find him. And let's just say that they uncovered some evidence, some physical evidence in the valley at one point. And that raised a whole other set of questions about what might have happened. And to me, I guess one of the more confounding things is, how did that evidence get to where it was? Because there are some people that even still, people I've talked with think that this was just an accident and he might have just slipped and fallen into the river. To me, I accept that possibility, but there is too much other evidence, including some physical evidence, that speaks to something very, very different. One of two big, curious possibilities. And so I guess without giving away too much, I think the collection of what was found, I think, remains still quite confounding to me. And because he disappeared, the other interesting aspect is that because he disappeared in a place with no cell service, no Wi-Fi, the amount of information that can be gleaned from a place like that was really, and a very, very remote. I had to track down shepherds and pilgrims and trekkers and the very, very few group of people who had potentially crossed paths with him and managed to find most of them. But it occurred into this place where, out of all the information I could get from social media, there was this one kind of dark spot in Justin's story, and it just so happened to be his final few days. Right. And to me, that will always be this like kind of, in some ways, kind of fitting end to this story, I think. Yeah. I hope it ends on kind of a hopeful note.
When that physical evidence showed up, to which you are so deftly referring, that was like a kind of like, what, like kind of moment for me. That was crazy. Oh, that the true crime parts of this book are just incredible. All right, we're gonna do two quick audience questions because we have gone so far over time. Harley, thank you for sticking around. Let's do two quick questions. I think we had one from Chris. We're gonna put up here. Would you second guess any part of what you wrote if he did emerge and read your book? Did you write it assuming he would never see it?
Yeah, great question. Would I second guess anything? Nobody knows Justin as well as he does. So I did my absolute best by speaking with hundreds and hundreds of people and doing years of research to paint an accurate picture. So I don't think there's nothing in here that I question. This is a portrait of a person to the best of my possible ability. And I think in terms of what I've included, I think he would probably understand why I included what I did and potentially what I left out. So I don't think I would second guess anything. And I don't want to give too much away, but I don't think I didn't necessarily write this expecting him to read it. And I don't think that does give anything away, but because in either possibility, if something tragic did happen to him, and if he is still potentially out there wandering, I think somebody as dedicated and devoted as Justin is, if he had found his path and was completely devoted to it, I don't think he would necessarily show up and walk into a bookstore and pick up a book. I think he would have found his mountain, his cave, and his view and stayed.
Yeah, I agree. So we have one last question here, which ironically was going to be my final question, and I thought I was just so brilliant because I had thought of this question. But here, Mary has thought of this question as well. Question: if Harley could meet Justin today, is there one question? Oh, actually, this is the opposite of my question. Is there one question he would ask Justin? Oh, no, it is. Sorry, excuse me. If Harley could meet Justin, is there one question that you would ask him? And just to like say where I was coming from on this, I mean, I feel like to make sure you kind of answer this in the right way. I mean, the question you wouldn't ask him, we're not looking for, where were you? Like, what happened? Because obviously you would ask that question.
Yeah. Where have you been? Yeah.
Right. But the question, I think, really the heart of this question, what I want to know is, like what else is there? I mean, he did a lot of podcasts before, maybe, and a lot of people asked him a lot of questions. Is there something deep down that you wish you could get out of him?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think there was, I don't know if it's necessarily one specific question, but I would love to sit down with him and have him kind of explain in his own words, and you're right, he was asked about this in podcasts and in kind of blog posts when he was interviewed as kind of this rising Instagram star, traveler. But he never was really clear on if he believed in God, or what kind of faith did he belong to, or how did he see the world through that lens. Because he said a couple times that he saw which kind of fits into a very kind of common thing right now, which is people seeing themselves as spiritual, not religious. And he rejected a lot of the big religions, even though he had this really personal connection with Buddhism. But I think that's something that I've always kind of remained very curious about, is for him to kind of map that road for me. And I tried to do that the best of my ability in the book, of his kind of spiritual trajectory. But how much of that was kind of rooted in a belief in something bigger, or how much of that was deeply kind of rooted in curiosity. And I think that's something that I've always really admired about him. He was somebody that was deeply, profoundly curious about himself, about what he believed in, about where he was going in his life and the world around him. And that's something that I've taken away from him, honestly, as someone who's gotten to know him through writing this book, and I hope I don't lose that. I hope I don't lose that kind of very Justin, wide-eyed curiosity with the world, and never wanting to stop asking questions.
Well, folks, this has been such a treat for me. This interview is so great. It's been so nourishing for me just to talk to you, Harley. I mean, this is what a great story, and thank goodness you told it. I really enjoyed this book, and this interview was terrific.
Thank you so much for having me on. Same here. This has been wonderful. So thank you so much for your time, and thanks for everyone for joining us.
You got it. You got it. All right, folks, we'll see you in 2 weeks. And we're going to have Kimberly Jones on the show. It's going to be terrific. But in the meantime, do yourself a favor. This book was published early in the year, but I feel like about 11 months from now, it's going to be ending up on a lot of lists of best books of the year. So get in on it early. Thank you, everybody, for joining. And Harley, best of luck, and can't wait to read what you come out with next.
Thank you so much, Mark.
All right, take care, everybody.